So they don't overlap, so it seems they can't share anything. At the same time, they share a color. What's going on here? How can three things that don't share anything share something? Put slightly less paradoxically, how can three things which have no spatiotemporal overlap have one shared property between them? Okay, that's a little less paradoxical way of phrasing it, but it still seems very puzzling. Okay? How can that be? That's the problem of the one over the many. Okay? Whenever you have things that share something in common, right, they are both many because they are distinct individuals, but also one in that they are all the same property. Okay, so you have one sort of unifying or encompassing many, and it seems both really ordinary, common, everyday occurrence, and deeply intellectually puzzling. Because on the one hand, they share something, but it's impossible, it seems, for that something to be spatiotemporal because they are completely distinct spatiotemporally. Okay? What that naturally leads us to then is that whatever properties are, okay, they are not particulars in space and time. Okay? The properties that they share, right, if it's true that those three cherries are all red, so therefore they share a color, but those three cherries do not share anything in space and time. They do not overlap, they don't have parts in common, they are, let's say there's a millimeter between each of them, they're not even contacting each other, then the color, it seems, can't be something in space and time, because the things in space and time, or put it this way, there's nothing in space and time that they share, but they do share a color. So color, presumably, is not in space and time. That's a strange conclusion. Right? Right? What's obvious to our eyes is that the cherries are all red. They actually share a color. Okay? But all parts in space and time that they might overlap in are missing. There are no overlapping parts in space and time for those cherries, right? So there are no particulars in space and time that those three cherries share. So their redness, their color, can't be a particular in space and time. Okay? Whatever color is, goes this line of reasoning, it is not something that has a particular boundary or location in space and time. All right? Redness can exist fully in three distinct spatiotemporal places. Okay? And it exists as a whole in each of those places. It's not as though the cherries, this cherry has part 1J of red, and this cherry has part 17C of red, and this cherry has part 394JKL of red, right? Like, it's not like these are, you can see that these are distinct pieces of a bigger whole. It's like, that's a red cherry, and there's a perfectly red cherry right there, both perfectly red. Redness can be instantiated all over the place in space and time, and it's still the same color. Right? This is what seems to be suggested by our eyes. I look at that picture, and I see three things that look the same color to me. There is some splotchiness there, I grant you. They're not exactly the same color all over, but there are definitely parts of each of those cherries that are completely distinct spatiotemporally and are both perfectly red, or all three perfectly red. Even if slightly different, clearly redness in all cases. Okay. So the weird conclusion we come to is that color does not seem to be in space and time, because it doesn't have boundaries to the way that an ordinary object does, right? An ordinary object can only ever be located at one place at a time, not the color red. It can be located all over the place at a given time. And moreover, it can be shared by objects that don't share anything in space and time, that have no overlap in space and time. Those cherries might never come into contact with each other and still all be red. So it seems that the color red is abstract. It's outside of space and time. Very, very surprising conclusion to reach, right? From just looking at this picture and thinking about it. Or looking at cherries or grapes or whatever in your hand and just thinking about them. Or looking out your window and seeing 3 green leaves and thinking about that. Bizarre. We come to this really radical sounding conclusion, right? Color, like red, is abstract. Traits in general that individuals can share are themselves not individuals. They are outside of space and time in some way. So it seemed to Plato. Okay, and so it seemed to Bertrand Russell. I asked you to read. Okay. So this is a way of getting into the Platonic idea of forms. Okay, what Plato called forms, I've been calling a property or a universal or something abstract and outside of space and time, right? Plato called these forms, okay? And anything really that's abstract in the sense that it can be fully instantiated at separate places in space and time, he called it a form. We call them universals or properties, right? The property of being red, the universal redness that all those 3 cherries have in common or share, despite not having in common or sharing anything spatiotemporal. Right? Puzzling situation. One solution to it, right? Okay, so I'll go back for a second. We have a puzzle here, right? Things that don't share anything in space and time are the same color. So they don't share anything in space and time, but they share a color. That's the puzzle. How could that be? One answer is the thing they share, the color red, isn't something in space and time, right? That just seems to Plato and Russell to follow from the reasoning, which is that things that don't share anything in space and time nevertheless share a color. Okay? So properties are abstract. They aren't things in space and time. They are things that can reappear all over space and time and still be one thing. Now that itself is a curious idea, but it does seem to be what is suggested by the puzzle here. And the puzzle is grounded in the most ordinary kinds of perception, like looking at these cherries. You look at 3 cherries and all of a sudden you're believing in forms, right? I mean, this is the wild ride of metaphysics, folks, right? You end up with a really seemingly hard to believe conclusion. Well, it wasn't hard to believe for Plato. Plato thought that this was the general structure of reality. Reality is particulars that instantiate forms, right? This is how we explain how an individual gets structure, how it gets a feature set, how it gains characteristics. It does it by, in some sense, instantiating the forms and one particular will instantiate these forms, and another particular will instantiate those forms, and that's how things are differentiated from each other. To relate this to Leibniz's principle of the identity of indiscernibles, if you had two things which instantiated all and only the same forms, they would actually be one thing, on his view. Okay, so we start with a puzzle which is grounded in the most ordinary kinds of experience. The puzzle, right, is taken by people such as Plato and Russell to suggest that reality actually consists of two realms. Okay, there's the spatio-temporal, where things have particular locations, and then there is the abstract realm of universals, or what Plato called forms, which is what gives structure to those particulars by those particulars instantiating them. So again, each of these cherries instantiates the universal red. But there are some universals those cherries do not instantiate. For example, green, which is going to distinguish them from leaves. And each of those will have some forms it instantiates that the others don't. Right? Like it might have a certain size. None of those is exactly the same size, maybe. But if they are exactly the same size, there'll be something else that distinguishes them, at least according to Leibniz. Okay, so obviously this is a fairly radical conclusion to reach, so many are skeptical, right? Throughout the history of philosophy, many have rejected Plato's views on this, okay? In particular, many people think, rather than conclude from this puzzle that there's this abstract realm of forms, okay, here's the puzzle, 3 objects, 1 color. You say, well, one way to make this make sense is to assume that the color is something over and above any of the spatio-temporal particulars. It's a universal that gets shared repeatedly in its entirety somehow. For things in space and time, that doesn't make sense. Nothing in space and time can be repeatedly instantiated fully at a given time, right? It has just one location at a time. Forms are different. They can be fully instantiated at different places throughout reality. They exist in a different realm, higher dimensionality, right? The abstract. To others, the more obvious solution is just to deny that there's one color here, right? Let's say, well, look, one way of resolving this puzzle is to believe in this abstract realm of forms, okay? Another is just to deny that there truly is anything common here. There's just that individual redness in the cherry, that individual redness in the cherry, and that individual redness in the cherry, and those 3 particular rednesses, if I may speak that way, resemble each other. So the mind puts it together as one color. But it's actually 3 distinct colors, maybe you would call them colorations, that are similar to each other. That's all. So the natural kind of skeptical reaction to the Platonic reaction, the skeptical reaction to the Platonic response, let us say, is to deny that there is really one color here. While Plato accepts that there's one color here, as does Russell, and therefore denies that everything is in space and time. There is what's in space and time, and then there is the abstract realm in addition to that. The natural skeptical response is to just deny one of the premises of the argument, that there's one color here, okay? And that's a very natural response. There's redness 1, redness 2, redness 3. Why do we think there's one color there? Well, they resemble each other. I mean, look at the picture, what they would say, right? There's redness 1 on the left, redness 2 in the middle, redness 3 on the right. And, that's just 3 distinct rednesses. There's 3 colors here, but they're colors that resemble each other. and they resemble